Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a seriously fascinating piece of history. We so often think of constitutions as these static documents, right? Like they were just written up in a single dramatic room by people in formal wear. But the reality for modern India was so much more intricate than that. It's actually a 200-year relay race of shifting policies, new laws, and massive, earth-shattering historical shifts.
And honestly, the whole thing starts with this pretty unbelievable question. How on earth did a corporate trading company, literally a business enterprise, end up ruling an entire subcontinent? Well, to understand that, we're going to use what I like to call the catalyst approach, because as we trace this history, you're going to notice a really distinct pattern. Almost every major constitutional leap or administrative change, it wasn't born out of careful, peaceful planning. No, it was born out of a blazing crisis. History is forged in the fires of necessity.
Okay, so let's map this out real quick. We're going to track this baton of power across 5 eras, moving from traders to territorial rulers, into the company rule era, the moment the crown takes control, the push for representation, and finally the road to independence.
Let's jump right into our first era, traders to territorial rulers, moving from commerce to conquest. Back in the early 1600s, the British presence in India was strictly business. There were no massive imperial armies marching around. It was just merchants looking to corner the market on things like spices and textiles. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter, which gave the East India Company exclusive trading rights. They landed in 1608, and for over a century and a half, making money was their one and only focus. But then we hit our first catalyst, the 1764 Battle of Buxar. The company's victory there totally shifted their identity. By 1765, they actually acquired the Diwani. That means they got the rights over revenue and civil justice for the wildly wealthy regions of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. I mean, just imagine a modern shipping giant suddenly being told they're now in charge of extracting taxes and running the court systems for millions of people. It was an absolutely absurd pivot.
And that monumental shift drops us right into our second era, the company rule era, where centralization begins.
As you might guess, running a corporation is very different from running a country. Widespread corporate mismanagement, severe financial troubles, and the truly devastating Bengal famine of 1770 exposed a massive, undeniable crisis. So, forced to step in, Parliament rolled out a timeline of laws starting in 1773. The whole goal here was to slowly strip away the East India Company's autonomy and centralize power back in London. The 1773 Regulating Act was step 1, designating a Governor-General of Bengal and legally recognizing the political functions of the company. But it was the next act that really shook up the entire structure.
By 1784, with Pitt's India Act, the British government brought in this system of double government. They literally split the company's identity right down the middle. The commercial business side stayed with the existing court of directors, but the political, military, and revenue affairs, those were handed over to a brand new body called the Board of Control, which answered directly to the British Parliament. So the line between business and state was now officially drawn in ink.
This centralization train reached its absolute peak about half a century later with the Charter Act of 1833. The Governor-General of Bengal was bumped up to the Governor-General of India, pulling all civil and military powers across the territory into one single office. Lord William Bentinck was the first guy to hold this immensely powerful title. Crucially, the 1833 Act also ended the company's commercial activities completely. They weren't a business anymore, they were purely an administrative machine. And by the 1853 Charter Act, they even lost the power of patronage, because open competition for the civil service was finally introduced.
But here's the thing. A system built entirely on extraction and foreign control can only last so long without a rupture. Which brings us to Era 3, the Crown takes control, marked by the massive turning point of 1857.
The Revolt of 1857, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny, was a bloody, massive crisis that completely shattered the status quo. The British government suddenly realized that leaving a subcontinent of that size in the hands of a corporation, even a highly regulated one, just wasn't viable anymore. So the immediate aftermath of the rebellion triggered a whole new wave of legislation, kicking off with the Government of India Act of 1858, followed by a series of council acts stretching into the early 20th century. Now, these acts weren't just about raw control. They were the beginning of a British attempt to slowly, carefully pull Indians into the administration. Why? Mostly to prevent another massive uprising.
So this 1858 Act, it fundamentally rewrote the entire org chart of India. The East India Company abolished entirely. Its power was transferred directly to the British Crown.
The title of Governor General was upgraded to Viceroy, meaning the direct representative of the Crown. And that board of control we talked about earlier, gone. It was replaced by a new cabinet-level position in London called the Secretary of State for India. The baton of power had officially passed from the corporate boardroom directly to the throne.
As we roll into the 20th century, we hit our fourth era, the push for representation, where Indians start demanding a real voice.
At this point, the catalyst for change was no longer just British administrative course correction. It was the rising, organized demands of the Indian people themselves. Leaders in groups like the Indian National Congress were pressing incredibly hard for self-governance and a real say in their own affairs. The British responded with the Indian Councils Act of 1909, also known as the Morley-Minto Reforms. Now, while it did allow an Indian to join the Viceroy's Executive Council for the very first time, it also introduced a highly consequential concept: communal representation. This specific reform created separate electorates for Muslims, meaning Muslim members were elected exclusively by Muslim voters. This legally embedded the concept of communalism right into the Indian electoral framework, a decision that would have profound, lasting impacts on the entire subcontinent.
Fast forward 10 years, and those demands for self-rule had only grown louder, leading to the Government of India Act of 1919. This act rolled out a new and honestly pretty complex administrative experiment called diarchy. Derived from the Greek word diarchy, meaning double rule, this was basically an attempt to give Indians some level of control at the provincial level, while the British still maintained a tight grip on the most critical levers of the state.
In reality, diarchy split provincial subjects right down the middle. You had the transferred subjects, things like health, education, and agriculture, and these were handed over to Indian ministers who were responsible to the Legislative Council. But then you had the reserved subjects. This was the real machinery of power: police, justice, land revenue, finance, and those kept securely in the hands of the British governor and his Executive Council. Unsurprisingly, this sort of half measure was largely unsuccessful and deeply unpopular across the board.
That relentless desire for true, uncompromising self-rule pushes us right into our final era, the road to independence and the final acts. This era was totally defined by mass protests and civil disobedience, led by iconic figures like Mahatma Gandhi. There was just a complete refusal by the Indian populace to accept these administrative half-measures any longer. When the British tried to evaluate their own reforms with the 1927 Simon Commission, which notably had 0 Indian members on it, it was fiercely boycotted across all of India. This intense political friction is what started actively shaping policy. For instance, the Communal Award of 1932 tried to extend separate electorates to the depressed classes. That led to Gandhi fasting in protest, which ultimately resulted in the Pune Pact, a really critical compromise with Dr. B.R. Ambedkar that kept reserved seats within a general electorate instead. The pressure cooker was officially whistling, forcing the British to draft a massive new constitutional framework.
And that framework was the colossal Government of India Act of 1935. This was a highly detailed, expansive document that did 3 major things. First, it finally scrapped that unpopular provincial diarchy. Second, it granted true provincial autonomy, allowing provinces to act as independent administrative units. And third, it divided legislative powers into federal, provincial, and concurrent lists. The takeaway here is absolutely crucial. The structure of this 1935 Act is basically the direct blueprint that foreshadowed the modern Indian Constitution.
But as we know, even the 1935 Act wasn't full independence. The final, definitive handover of power finally happened in the aftermath of World War II with the Indian Independence Act of 1947. This historic legislation ended over 2 centuries of British rule, tragically partitioned the subcontinent into 2 independent dominions, India and Pakistan, stopped all crown appointments to civil services, and most importantly, it empowered the respective constituent assemblies to draft their own futures. The baton had finally truly been passed to the people.
Which leaves us with this final, somewhat provocative thought. On January 26, 1950, the Constituent Assembly enacted the Constitution of India, establishing a sovereign democratic republic. But in doing so, they consciously repurposed massive amounts of the administrative scaffolding that had been built up over that 200-year history: the legislative lists, the civil service framework, the federal structure. The bureaucracy of an empire essentially became the foundation of a republic. So I want to leave you with this question to ponder. When you look at how the government operates today, how much of that 200-year-old past still governs our present? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking those great questions.